Well, tonight's topic, of course, is good sex. So I'm going to just start with a question. How many of you guys have kids? Okay, you guys have all had dinner. You guys can go home. So no, you want dessert? Okay. Well, then that means you'll be here for a little while before we have dessert. So, but we know that there's a lot more to good sex than just whether or not you can have kids. So, on July 20th, 1969, as commander of Apollo 11 lunar module, Neil Armstrong was the first person to set foot on the moon. And you're probably thinking, well, what does that have to do with good sex? But his first words after stepping on the moon were, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." And they were televised all around the world. But just before he re-entered the lunar lander, he made a remark, and that remark was, "Good luck, Mr. Gorski." And so there were people at NASA, they thought, well, okay, who's this Gorski guy? And they thought it may have been someone in the Soviet space program. Well, it wasn't anyone in the Soviet space program. It wasn't anyone in the American space program. And whenever anyone would ask him about that, he would just smile. And then on July 5th, 1995, in Tampa Bay, Florida, while answering some questions following his speech, a reporter brought up the old question, who is this Mr. Gorski? And Neil Armstrong said, okay, I can now answer that question because Mr. Gorski is dead. He said, in 1938, when I was a kid in a small Midwest town, I was playing baseball with a friend in the backyard. And his friend hit the ball into his neighbor's yard by the bedroom windows. And his neighbors were Mr. and Mrs. Gorski. As he leaned down to pick up the ball, Neil Armstrong heard Mrs. Gorski shouting at Mr. Gorski, "Sex? You want sex? You'll get sex when the kid next door walks on the moon." And so there you have it then. Good luck, Mr. Gorski.
There will be some things that Les and I will insert into tonight's talk that are not actually in your book. So feel free to write them down. This is a subject we talk about in the Relationship Builders class from a different perspective, because in that class we're talking to a lot of young kids who aren't married, a lot of them living together, but there's still some of it that we talk about in that class after marriage, what sex is supposed to look like, that we kind of integrated into here because we feel it's a very important component. The first thing I'm going to talk to you about are the 4 essentials of intimacy. Before we get knee deep in good sex, we need to talk about a word that is paramount important in your marriage. It can't be ignored in your marriage, and especially your sex life, because you'll pay an ultimate price. Everything that we have covered and learned in this course so far will help lead us to gain this ultimate prize in marriage, and that word is intimacy. It's not a word you hear a lot about. We hear the word sex talked about a lot, but intimacy is so much more than just sex. It's what our hearts long and desire for. It's what God created us for, and we will never be fulfilled until we find it first. First with God, and then with each other. Let's define intimacy. This is the definition. It's an inner closeness and a depth of our relationship. 2 big words, inner and depth. That means that we are completely open and vulnerable with each other. And trust me, when you deal with depression, I have to be open and vulnerable. We are in a marriage where there is nothing in the person that we are married to that we don't have complete access to. Naked and unashamed, the law of purity that God gave us. God uses the word one when he expressed the intimacy of marriage. Our spirit, our mind, and our emotions all becoming one. So let's talk about the 4 essentials of intimacy in marriage, and you'll begin to see how they weave their way into our talk tonight. And this is part of what is not in your book that we talk about in Relationship Builders that we think is so important, incredibly important. The first one is value. God doesn't just say that he loves us, he demonstrates his love. Are we willing to take everything in our life, our extended family, our parents, our church, our job, our ministry, our children, and are we willing to lay it down for our marriage? We do it with God, why don't we do it with our spouse? If you don't give these up for me, you don't value me, is what we're telling our spouse. You can say anything with your lips, but I'm listening to your life. It's what tells me everything. We need to do a self-reflection and find the areas in our marriage where we are communicating low value to our spouse. So I would encourage you to do that. And listen to what your spouse has to say. Because it's not about what you think, it's about what they feel and how they're feeling low value. The second one is energy. We have to work at it to be intimate. This is where our closeness comes from. The third one is sacrifice. Give it up. Say no. 1 Corinthians 4, even our bodies don't belong to us. We live in a society where people don't want to sacrifice for the marriage. It's not my money, my car. It's our money, our car, our family, our children. The word my kills relationships. The word ours builds relationships. The fourth one is trust. Trust creates safety. It allows us to be exposed. You create an atmosphere of trust where I can come in and take responsibility for your words and actions. When you say something wrong, you're willing to admit it. When you do something wrong, you're willing to admit it. And when our spouse will not take responsibility for their behavior, we cannot be intimate with them. It's very difficult. The only way that we can be intimate is if we establish an atmosphere of absolute value. Nothing is as important to me as you are. There is no price that I wouldn't pay to solve the problems in our marriage. I'm here for you for the rest of my life. I'm not going anywhere. I'll never leave you or forsake you. We say that in our vows. Until you have established that spirit in your marriage, you will never open your heart up to each other completely. Maybe just a little bit, but never totally completely. And you're never going to be satisfied with a little bit, because God didn't create us to be a little bit intimate. We were created by a big, huge God to be in oneness with each other, to have incredible big intimacy. God created us to be loved and to love. It's our greatest need. And rejection is our greatest fear. 1 John 4:18 says, there is no fear in love. Perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves torment. But he who fears has not been made perfect in love. So we can't have intimacy until the fear of rejection is gone from our lives. It has to be cast out. Because I'm saying, if I open myself to you and I'm intimate with you and you see who I really am, and then you reject me, I don't want to be intimate with you again. Because you've devalued me. I can't trust you. Hebrews 13:5 says, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. God makes that absolute commitment to us. And so we have to make that commitment to our spouse. We might never leave our spouse, but we can forsake our spouse. And forsake means to turn our heart away. God's perfect love casts out fear, and then we realize he never leaves us or forsake us. God has to remove fear before we can be intimate with him. I will be honest with you and tell you that when I am in my depression, the last person I want to be intimate with is God. And if I can't be intimate with him, then I really don't want to be intimate with less. So one of the greatest problems in marriage is that we enter in with the baggage of the rejection of our past. We have all experienced rejection. Whether you were a kid and you were bullied at school, you had parents who left you, got divorced. You can't have intimacy in your marriage unless you cast out rejection. And the way that we do that is by creating value day in and day out with the person that we're married to. Not just by our words, but by our deeds. You tell them, I will never leave you or forsake you. Speak it out. Just because you say that on your wedding day doesn't mean the last day that's the last time you'll ever say that. And this is a big one for Les and I in our family. You will never have intimacy if there's a back door open. Divorce. Don't ever talk about divorce. That was a pledge we made to each other. It was never an option for our kids. We've already shared with you that I've been down that road. And we said we're never going down there again. We don't communicate the commitment that God communicates. We don't communicate the value that God communicates. And that's why we don't experience the intimacy that only God can experience and create within our relationship. So we have to have Him to help us do it.
Okay. And we all know, we've heard it time and time again, but our sex relationship is a very vital part of our marriage. I mean, it's just something that has to be there. Judith Wallerstein, who's a clinical psychologist, and she's actually recognized as the world's leading expert on the effects of divorce. And rather than marriage, I mean, her expertise is in the area of divorce. So she says it's very important for all couples to find ways to protect their privacy, to cherish their sexual relationship, and to guard it fiercely. A richly rewarding and stable sex life is not just a fringe benefit, it is the central task of marriage. In a good marriage, sex and love are inseparable. Sex serves a very serious function in maintaining both the quality and the stability of the relationship, replenishing emotional reserves, and strengthening the marital bond. And I know that when we're having sex, that those aren't the things that they're thinking about, but it's really an important glue that really helps keep us together. But one of the problems that we have today, especially in our society, is that Western culture has totally changed what sex is. We're constantly inundated with sexually provocative pictures, articles, TV, films, movies, and it's so skewed what a sexual relationship is. I mean, even to the point of some of the things that we see on television, it's just completely different. But it's generally divorced from a long-term relationship. When you see the things that we talk about on television or we see it in films, it's not about a long-term relationship. Most films suggest that good sex is about instant gratification. A beautiful woman, a ripped guy, get in bed together, the sex is instantaneously wonderful. And I can't remember the last time that I saw a film about a couple that had been married for 20 years and were having sex. So you just don't see them. So the impression that we get is that the sexual relationship wanes with age and familiarity, so that good sex is found in a new relationship or an affair. And that couldn't be anything farther from the truth. I mean, I know that for Teresa and I, after being together for 23 years and being empty nesters, and soon not to be empty nesters again, by the way, so that's... But we enjoy sex more today than we ever did when we were first married. So it's something that gets much better with age. There's a writer out there, and this particular lady, she wrote a book that's called Sex is Not Compulsory. But she lays a claim that all sexual relationships have a natural lifespan. For some, that may be a week. For others, that may be 20 years. But if you try to extend your sexual relationship beyond its natural life, you're asking for trouble. And guys, that cannot be anything farther from the truth. I mean, that's something that we see in movies or see on television, but that's not what it's all about. That's highly dangerous. It doesn't match up with experience of thousands of married couples. I know it doesn't match up with the married couples here, and it definitely doesn't match up with our experience. God's designed sex for a long-term relationship that can grow and deepen in pleasure and significance as our marriage matures. So it's a long-term, it's like a great bottle of wine. A couple in their late 60s who have been married for 36 years wrote, "Sex is first of all for deepening a couple's relationship of love. If this was not so, God would not have allowed this part of our being to go on with vigor and ardor, well beyond the years of childbearing. And let's face it, if it was just to make babies, we'd quit having sex at 50 and just be playing golf or hunting or whatever it would be. That's not what God's intended for it to be at all."
Sex is a way of communicating love that goes beyond words. It is ultimate body language. Not only does sex express the one flesh bond, which we talked about earlier, but every time a couple makes love tenderly and passionately, the bond is strengthened. So critical. Sadly, many couples give up when the initial infatuation dies down. They give up through tiredness. They give up if complacency sets in. And we'll be honest and tell you, all of those will happen in your marriage. So if you're not understanding the plan God has for sex and the most important part of that in your marriage, you will not make it through those stages. A report, they have a report from the British National Survey of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles, and it showed that while outside marriage sex is widely regarded as a normal part of a relationship, within marriage, thousands of couples have spurned sex in favor of chastity. Research reveals that up to 1 in 30 of all couples are opting for celibacy in their relationships because they have neither the time nor the inclination for sex. You want to talk about a picture for ending a marriage? That would be it. Because God's design for sex is a vital part of our relationship in our marriage. Without it, your marriage will die. In case you've been given the wrong impression, let us assure you, God loves sex. He created it. And if you have any doubt about it, we encourage you to read the book out of the Bible called the Song of Songs. This is also a book, the Book of Romance. It's what Solomon says about love, sex, and intimacy. This is an incredible book. Be prepared. He walks you through the Song of Solomon and opens your eyes up to things that are so graphic and a part of God's plan from the moment that couple started their relationship till their marriage and into their later marriage years. This is an incredible book. And we will have, I'll set these books over there when we're done with the books that we have at the table. Right in the middle of the Bible, that Song of Songs talks about a highly erotic love poem celebrating the sexual relationship between a man and his new bride. In this love poem, we see that sex is not just physical. It's an emotional connection of their souls. It's actually a spiritual act, an act of worship, glorifying God and honoring Him. So a lot of couples don't understand the spiritual dynamic of sex. It's so incredibly important. And I can't explain it to you, but all I know is it's real. And that when it's combined, when your sex life is combined with what God wants out of you, you go to a level, on a spiritual level, that is undescribable in your marriage, in your sex life. You have to trust God on that one. We cannot engage in a sexual act and not have it connect us to the spiritual realm. It's impossible. We cannot compartmentalize our sexual relationship. It affects the rest of our marriage, even our relationship with God, since He's the one that created it, and we talked about intimacy. Sex is not the icing on the cake. It is the vital ingredient in the cake itself. Without sex, a husband and a wife become roommates, not lovers, like God's called us to be.
Okay, so two things we're going to look at tonight. We're going to look at how to maintain a sexual relationship over the entire course of your marriage. So from the time you're first married until the time that you die. And then also to how to re-stimulate sexual desire. One of the things that I think is key is that we've got to be deliberate. And it doesn't just happen by itself. We have to work, it's an area that we have to work at hard in our marriage. And we talked about this earlier. One of the 4 essentials of intimacy that Teresa talked about was energy. So that's a key part of that. And this is where our culture gets it wrong. Sexual desire can be and must be reawakened. It's not something that just tends to go away. And we can't leave it just to feelings. Judith Wallerstein also goes on to say that although building a sexual relationship is one of the most pleasurable tasks of marriage, it certainly is not the easiest. And I know that for Teresa and I, it hasn't always been the easiest thing to do. It requires delicacy, sensitivity, and patience. It takes time and a willingness and ability to accommodate the other person's needs. It's not about our needs, it's about our spouse's needs. This complex sexual dance doesn't just happen without trial and error. Everyone runs into problems before finding breakthroughs, and everyone needs to explore. And I know that's most couples are going to struggle in their sexual relationship at one time or another, and there's 1,000 reasons that struggle can take place. You may not be feeling physically attractive, or you may not be feeling attracted to your spouse. You may not be able to identify why you're finding that sex is hard, or why that you just can't have physical intimacy. There may be you may be feeling vulnerable or threatened in a situation. The list goes on and on, and it could be. We talk about in Relationship Builders, one of the key areas that we talk about is, we call it it's our baggage talk. That it depends on what kind of baggage you bring into the marriage with you. So it's really what your upbringing is, what you experienced as a child or in high school with your friends, whatever it may have been taken place. And even in the church, from the church's perspective, the church doesn't talk about sex. We're kind of like the Dr. Phil and the Dr. Ruth at Canyon View Vineyard Church. When we started giving the talk at Relationship Builders, we got to give the talk not because we were experts about it, but because nobody else wanted to talk about sex. So it was by default that it fell on our shoulders. And so after that, after reading lots of books and speaking on it a lot, it became something that was really, really important to us. And we realized how important it was to marriage as well. And we may have used sex wrongly. Sometimes past sex relationships, whether you lived together, had premarital sex, can cast a shadow over our marriage. And that was an area that was hard for Teresa and I as well, because even though I hadn't been married before, I hadn't kept myself pure either. And Teresa had been married before. And then we lived together as well. So for us, that was we had lots of issues in that area. So we want to pay tribute to those of you for whom sex has not been easy, because, like I said, we know it's not. Perhaps it's painful or impossible through an accident or an illness, and we've dealt with folks where that's been an issue. For Teresa, with her depression, we know that's the farthest thing from her mind when she's in one of her down cycles on that. So, but in spite of that, if you've continued to grow closer together despite disappointments and difficulties, if you keep talking about it, refusing to allow it to become an area that you're just not going to go there. But if you're committed to expressing your love for each other in physical ways, you're still seeking to grow in this area of your marriage. That's key, and that's what God has really got planned for you.
Well, and I think when we talk about intimacy, that's where I hope you guys realize that sex is being intimate. It's not just about sex, because if that's all it was about for Les and I, there would be no reason for him to hang around with me for the times that I walk this road. What reason does he have if that's what it's all about? No, we've learned to define what intimacy is by God's standards in our lives. And if that means just going to bed at night and holding each other and knowing that I have somebody there who cares and knows how I feel, that's intimacy. It's still a part of being sexual, but it doesn't have to be the act. And it's so critical and so important to understand that, because I can't tell any one of you couples what's ahead. None of us know what's ahead. And so we don't know what we're going to experience. And we have to be ready. We have to be able and willing to work at it where we're at now. So when we get there, we know what to do.
In our experience, the majority of difficulties are resolved through a better understanding of each other, and that really is. And that's the intimacy equation. Making some changes in our behavior and our lifestyle may be necessary. 20% or so of those with difficulties need more help. There could have been abuse issues from previous marriage or previous relationships. And those are areas that it's tough to resolve in a class setting like this. That's where we can hook you up with mentor couples, or there are areas that we can work with on that. But if you're just struggling to seek to move forward together, don't regard this as your issue or my issue. It really becomes our issue. And we've talked about that earlier tonight as well. So we're going to look at 6 elements, all of which belong to the dynamic process of developing our sexual relationship. And just tonight, there just may be one of these areas that you think you need to focus on. And with the exercise that we're going to be doing tonight, you're going to have plenty of time to work on some of the specifics.
The first one is the importance of communication. In real life, sex is not always absolutely